Welcome to the Boardroom Sessions podcast. In these sessions, we meet the most amazing and interesting people. We learn about their passions, their business models, cool new technologies, and of course, their lessons on personal growth. I hope you enjoy. In this Boardroom Sessions podcast, we get to meet Ed Tyson. Ed and I have known each other for a few years. Ed's an executive coach and consultant. He has a company called PerSynergy Consulting, has just recently written a book. The book is called From Expert to Executive, Mastering the SOPs of Leading. We dive into the details of the book. We talk a little bit about his cool van, and we talk about the methodologies and framework of which he's building here on the plan. I think you're going to find it very interesting and informative. Look forward to hearing your feedback. Ed Tyson, welcome to the Boardroom Sessions podcast, buddy.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, so Ed, you and I have known each other for a little while. We've been networking in the same group of folks. You've been a pretty good regular at the Orange County Technology Professionals Group. You're a good buddy of my friend Devin's. And more importantly to me, you're the guy with the van. You have the mobile communications center. Tell us a little bit about your super cool Sprinter van and why I'm such a big fan of it.
Sure. Well, we call it our mobile coach, and we use it for not just mobile officing, but also mobile coaching. And it might sound a little strange, but a lot of the executives that I work with don't like sitting in their fishbowl offices with everybody looking in at them. And it makes it a little hard for them to kind of, get vulnerable. And so a number of them started saying things to me like, hey, can we do this at a coffee shop or somewhere else? And of course, a lot of my clients are a good ways away from my office, so had no good place for them to meet, because it's certainly not a great place to bring it even more public venue. So we got the idea through the need that I had at the time anyway to just work remotely when I was in a city all day, far from home. And boy, has it worked out great.
So if you guys could visualize a big Sprinter van with 4 recliner, big seats, leather seats that are facing each other, with a big conference room table in the middle, big screen TV set up for video conferencing, cooler, cappuccino machine, plenty of air conditioning, and a very private environment to have a good conversation on wheels. That's what we're talking about here. The mobile consulting unit. That's classic. And I've been in it. I posted a LinkedIn post on it and got a few thousand hits on it. People really wanted to come check it out. So Ed, bring that to one of the OCTPs and we'll set it up out front and give people a tour.
Yeah, you got it.
Awesome. So you're an executive coach and a consultant, and you consult to the C-suite and some big places. How did you tell us a little about your journey? How did you get there and get to the place where you felt you had the chops to give advice to the C-suite?
Sure. Well, when I first got out of school, I didn't feel like I was in a position to give that kind of advice. I didn't have the life experience or the work experience to do that. My graduate degree was in organizational effectiveness, organizational psychology. So certainly that's what I wanted to do, but I knew I wasn't equipped just then to do it. And so I just went to work, and I worked for a couple of large publicly traded and private healthcare companies and worked my way up till finally I got up to those executive ranks, was hired away from a competitor, had been working on the East Coast where I was born and raised, got here to Irvine, and then really took one more step, became the VP of Strategy and Development. And then when the strategy of the organization began to shift, we decided that we needed to be private to make kind of investments that we wanted to in the future. And that resulted in us actually kind of doing a reverse sale to the original company that I worked for back east. And so I made a kind of a clutch decision as that deal was coming together that rather than go back east, I would stay here and nail a shingle to my house and start up a little business.
And how did that start? I mean, how did you go about finding, this is where This is what I always go to here on these conversations, and when people have made big shifts in their career. What was that like? Walk me through that moment of, and was there uncertainty? Was there intrepidation, excitement, whatever you want to call it? How did you find your first client? Walk us through that first part of the journey there.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, a lot of fear wrapped up in moving from the safety of a full-time job, and not just that, but a pretty darn good job. And suddenly giving all that up for the world of consulting, and not just, that's a radical transition itself, being a kind of an internal facing person and moving to an external type of service model, but also just, being an entrepreneur. And so the very early steps for me, I always say I cheated a little bit because I had some liquid courage. And that is that in that transaction I was talking about, certainly walked away with enough funds to survive for a year.
A bridge.
And
a
that
bridge,
just
we call
gave
that.
me, exactly, the bridge. And that gave me the courage I needed to take those steps. And in terms of how I did it, man, I just reached out to my network and made sure that everyone, subsidiary presidents that I had done a lot of work for, that was kind of internal strategy work, vice presidents of human resources that I had worked with, that I knew had moved on to other organizations and other sectors, and just kind of started shaking those trees. And sure enough, after 3-4 months of really pounding the pavement, making sure everyone knew what I was doing, and the people that knew me well, I let them know I was taking a big risk. And that nothing like asking somebody for help and for thinking about you that you've been in a trench with before and done good work with, to have them rise to the occasion and start making referrals to you. And that's exactly what happened.
That's great. So let's talk a little bit about your program, right? So I've heard you call it a framework. I've heard you call it a methodology. Tell me how you would describe it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So often I use those words and people are nodding their head yes, but they're not really understanding that I really do mean, I'm not just throwing some adjectives out there, I really do mean it's both a framework and a methodology. So let me back up and say what it is. I've got a leadership model called the Leadership SOPs. And what's interesting is the SO and the P there are a mnemonic double entendre, right? Help you remember both my framework and my methodology. So if we start with the methodology first, it's probably just what you and all of your listeners thought of right away, which is standard operating procedures for leading. And it is that. And in fact, that's the methodology that we suggest leaders use to really establish how they're going to engage in the act of leading. In terms of a framework, though, that S, O, and P also stand for the work you have to do as a leader, and that's structure, operate, and perfect communities of effort.
And communities of effort, is that a fancy way of saying team, like a team or organization?
It is a very fancy way of saying team. So the reason we use that term is the word team has gotten to be so almost transactional. It's so commonplace. And the words, if you think about those two operative words there, community and effort, the community is really describing almost a volition, a choice to be a part of something. And it's also suggesting interdependence and trust. And effort is a really huge piece of this because it's really focusing us on the means and not the ends. So a lot of traditional definitions of leadership are what I call goal-centric. They're talking about getting and achieving an objective through or with others. A lot of people will define leadership in some way that sounds like that. And what we say is that's really, when you start focusing on the ends like that, you actually are setting yourself up on a slippery slope for the ends to justify the means, when in fact, it's got to be the exact opposite. As a leader, you have to be focused on building the means, lest you get to the end and have no means to succeed. So That's a big part of our core beliefs.
And so you put a lot of thought and effort into these words, right? Like instead of just calling it a team, you dive into words like communities of effort, and then you go into the background of each of those words and how they support your overall goal here. I like that. There's a lot of meaning in everything that you're doing here. And so,
well, it's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to continue on tell me about your SOPs.
Yeah. So, I appreciate you queuing in on the meaning of the words, because I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is key everyone into the fact that leading is one of those ubiquitous things that everybody knows but doesn't know. And so I'm trying to give us more operative words that put us into action better, because we're really faced with a crisis today. Every executive will tell you we don't have enough leaders leading. We've got people in the role, but we don't have enough leaders leading. And whether they're people I'm working with talking about the leaders that work for them, or they're talking about themselves, there's just this giant admission that it's a huge problem.
Right. And so when you find these executives, these business leaders, these C-suite folks, and how quick are they to identify with you where they think they have a gap? Or is it on you to, through conversation and effort, find out where there might be some opportunity for you to help? Walk me through a little bit about that initial part of the process, right? That's not defined in your methods here. That's more along the lines of discovery of the need.
Sure. Well, really the process that I use for coaching, and it's in fact included in the Leadership SOPs model, is called the ECTM transformation model. And the E stands for exploration or explore. And so what we really do as part of the initial process for coaching is start to explore the issue of self-picture. Where do I feel like the gaps are? Where do I think the gaps are as an individual leader? What's things I've heard from other people, et cetera. So then we take that self-picture and we find ways to challenge it. So I either do 360 interviews where I interview a lot of different stakeholders. Maybe they're employees, maybe they're even employees of your employees. Perhaps they're your peers, maybe they're members of the board.
Right.
But we get a variety of perspectives, either by, one-on-one interviews or using, an online assessment to challenge the self-picture. And what that does is it builds self-awareness, right? It uncovers gaps. It amplifies maybe things we would suggest ourselves, or, maybe I could focus on this. Well, it turns out when you ask other people, they would say that should be your priority.
Yeah, it's a bigger gap than they think, right?
Exactly right. And that's what brings us actually to that next letter there. I was saying that it's the ECTM transformation process, and that E stands for explore, and the C stands for clarify. And that's the next part, is you take that data plus your own understanding, and then add to that where your team is and where your organization is. And you start to clarify what are the steps we need to take together. And that's kind of how our journey starts out. That's start really every executive coaching engagement just like that.
Okay. So those conversations happen pretty readily. Folks, if they're willing to take time to meet with you, they traditionally know they're trying to get somewhere that they're hoping you can help.
It is a mixed bag. So sometimes we've worked with somebody in it from moment one, they're just in it. And then other people take a bit of time to get that vulnerable, to get that clued in, and to take advantage of the opportunity.
Okay. So you're writing a book right now on this very topic, right? The book's called From Expert to Executive, Mastering the SOPs of Leading. Tell us about the decision to go and write a book. What's the goal here?
Well, I'm really trying to move my business from, what I would almost just call that typical dollar for hire work to something much more scalable, where I can reach more people, where I can begin to productize some of my offering. I'm looking at not just, of course, like everybody writing a book, looking at things like keynote speaking, but also converted the model into a very detailed cohort training process in partnership with a company called Leaderology. Also, I have not just the executive coaching, but kind of a consulting and coaching certification process in the leadership SOP. So other practitioners can.
Yeah. So I just had a podcast I had a podcast just a couple weeks ago, and one of the folks on the podcast there, Kristen Sargent, is a practitioner of a book called The Tools, and so she is a practitioner and went and studied and paid money to get certified, and now she is a practitioner of that set. So that's another large revenue opportunity. That and public speaking, right? So you get keynote speeches, work for companies that are looking for somebody to keynote. I've seen Matt Dixon of the Challenger Sale, Tiffany Bova, who wrote Growth IQ. I've seen them, and they normally hand out books, and talk about what they thought about in their book, and they have podcasts and media. So all of that's in the works for you here shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of it's already in process. Actually, we debuted the training I was talking about earlier last February, and of course, in the middle of a pandemic, a lot of our initial shots for this year's cohorts were delayed, but we actually have had almost $1 million in sales in that program already. So it's pretty exciting. So that's already launched. But then the other thing, I was also telling you about earlier when we were talking is we're looking at developing and launching, or we're really in the process of developing an application. So, we're kind of thinking leading, there's an app for that, right?
Oh, okay.
And not kind of leadership development, but actually an application that helps leaders lead.
That's fantastic. Apps and without going down the rabbit hole in that, have you done any development work there? How hard is it to develop an app these days?
Yeah, I would say that right now the biggest barrier has been time, because the core partners we've been joined up with here to do this, all of us are trying to get this going. We all believe in it, but it's like a side thing. And so we've really been working in the last month to move it to the front of the plate for all of us and make bigger and bolder investments of our time and our dollars to move from the MVP stage to really having a real product out there in the world. So we're hoping to release a beta in the second quarter of this year.
Oh, that's exciting. That's super, super exciting. So the whole process of writing a book, walk us through that. Like, you get to a point where you understand that you've seen folks do what you just described, the whole building a program, building a process, training people to do it. You see the value in moving from the B2B, the belly to belly, or the business to business kind of model, to the B2C, to the client, or a lot of different people, the consumer model that you're describing here when you do write a book. But what is in the effort? I mean, okay, you want to write a book, you've got an idea, you put a pen to paper, but then what?
Yeah. Well, for me, it really started with having something to say. And I know you kind of started like, okay, that's the starting point, right? But the problem is, at least for me, and I'm sure for other people who are thinking about doing this too, is that I had a sense for what I wanted to say, but I hadn't really distilled it down into something that was compact and transferable, memorable, and that just impassioned me. So really the first part of my journey was to really conceptualize all these ideas I had floating around and put them in the melting pot and forge something much more meaningful and impactful. And for me, that was the leadership SOPs. And so I actually, prior to really putting pen to paper for the book, I worked almost 3 years at kind of canonizing everything that I was thinking into one model that really represented both that methodology and the framework that I was sharing with you. And so that was the first step. Just having something to say that was worth saying. I love the TED Talk motto of, ideas worth sharing. it's kind of like that. You have to be committed to the idea that you've got something nailed, that you're saying succinctly in an impactful way that can help the world.
Yeah,
and I've definitely reached that place.
Then you can get the passion around it, right? You can get that energy around it. You can get all of that momentum that you're going to build, to launch that. That you have to have that. I would give that a given, right? But I guess the question I'm asking is, then what? I mean, do you go? Is there a place to go to find an author, a publisher? I mean, if you're the author, where do you go? Do you go find a publisher? Do you just go to Google and say, how do I publish a book?
Well, I think that the path has many branches, so I'll just speak to kind of where I decided to go. And that is, once I had the concept and I was sure this is what I wanted to publish on, then I started thinking to myself, how do I want to deliver this? And for me, there were two really apparent choices. One was to write kind of what I would say is a dry, nonfiction account of the model itself. And the other option was to do what some other, pretty successful books have done, which is, write it inside a parable, tell a story, and bring the concept
Who Moved My Cheese, right, is a great example of that.
Absolutely great example. 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, another great example, Patrick Lencioni's book. And that's eventually what I decided to do. I felt like I could bring more color and life to the concepts by telling the story. And so what I realized right away, trying to do that on my own, is if I was going to write a story, I needed a storyteller. Because I have absolutely zero experience, aside from maybe 20 years ago in college, or even longer ago in high school, of doing real creative writing and writing dialogue, etc. So I actually hired a professional writer to help me bring the characters to life. And so together we worked, probably did almost 100 hours of interviews. And then what he did was create a character sketch. We went through using kind of, you think about the Myers-Briggs personality types or the DISC behavioral styles. And we went through, what did each character need to be like, et cetera. And he created kind of a fingerprint for each one of them of what was their backstory, what drove them. And then he took a swing at writing the story that we outlined together. Now, it had almost none of my model in it, but it was really crafting a poignant tale with kind of the right arc. And, that, just to give you a sense for the work that was yet to come, is once that was done, it was midsummer of last year, and I didn't go pens down and send this thing to the editor for about another 6 months. So that's how much work it took me to do. Once I just even had the basic story, now, of course, like a lot of practitioners, I'm wedging in client meetings and coaching and organizational redesigns and things like that in the midst of all of it. But it really was a lot of work of having to rewrite almost every piece of dialogue to make it work with my model. But I will tell you what Michael Ashley did for me is he made those characters come to life. And that now it is a compelling story. We've called it From Expert to Executive because it tracks a number of experts figuring out that in order to move towards being an effective, scalable, and sophisticated executive, they have to step away from their craft. And it really tells the story in a way that you identify with the different pain that causes people who everything they've become known as a professional is wrapped in what's special about their knowledge set and their capabilities.
And I think that the power in the story is incredible, right? So I talk a lot with folks out there, especially folks that are in transition, in job transition. And I consult with them on the power of telling their personal story, right? I think people are, I know It's science. People are trained to hear a story differently. They listen to a story differently. So if you're telling someone something matter of factly versus telling them in a story format, they're much, much more able to retain focus and get what you're trying to ultimately get across.
I think you're 1,000% right. It's exactly why I chose the path. And one other important reason that fed into it is, as I worked with clients, I mean, look, as I was spending a couple of years coming up with this, I was rapid cycle using the things in the model with my clients. And what I noticed is, even when I got really clear with my language, there were still a lot of whatabouts. There were still a lot of conversations about what that meant. There were still layers to the onion to peel away. They thought they got it, and then a month later, they're having a conversation with somebody else, and they come to a deeper understanding, and they come to me and say, I really get it at like a whole new level. And I just felt like a dry, nonfiction leadership book written like so many before it can't get those layers of understanding. It's just really hard to achieve. And plus the number of people willing to take that journey with you is so much lower.
That's great. There's so much to unpack here that when you and I first started talking about prior to the recording here, we were talking about what's next after the book. And you were very humble in your conversation with me around what you thought would be next. And quickly we're learning that you have it pretty well thought out, where you have that vision of having a program, having people teach the program or be practitioners of that program, having the keynotes and all that kind of fun stuff. How exciting is that? I think that's just incredible. And I'm a big visualization manifesting guy, so I'm certain that you can put a vision to that, what that looks like, of Ed at the podium, training the trainers and having the podcasts like you are on right now. Can you get your head wrapped around all of that? Can you see yourself doing all of that?
Absolutely. And in different phases, different components of it are in different phases of being done. So I've tested out my keynote speech with a group I'm on the board of. And I have delivered some certification training and done some of these things. And it is just, I am over the moon excited, but the operative word you use is how humbling it is. And for some reasons that I really didn't predict coming down the pike and getting here. And one is just the massive moment of vulnerability that I experienced sending this thing off to the editor. I mean, it was scary hitting that send button, just thinking about how many sentences, how many words, had I said things in the very right way? Was this really the end? Mike, I'm telling you, it was, it is. And then, have I said something that's going to embarrass me? Have I said something? And of course, the answer is yes.
Yeah, and the fear of...
Some people will love it and some people will hate it, of course.
The fear of what other people think is ingrained in us, but you have to rapidly get over that. But that feeling you described of the vulnerability and the pause when you do send it, that's where the magic is, right there. That's where all the energy of anything great in life comes from, is that risk. Without risk, no reward, right? That's it. You're on the precipice of big change. And I believe it doesn't matter whether you succeed or fail, because there's a way to go either direction, and how you handle that. It's all about the attitude and the willingness to risk. If you overcome your fear with that momentum of doing, that biggest step, I call it momentum, that biggest step of momentum is on your side, and it doesn't matter which direction it goes, because let's say you fail, you're going to do it again. You're going to do it again, and you're going to overcome it because you know how to do it. You just did it. More likely, I think this is going to be a success.
Thanks. And I'll tell you what, just your description there, what it reminded me of is the only other life experience where I was this surprised at my own emotions. And that was the first time I bungee jumped. I went bungee jumping with a couple of buddies on spring break 20 plus years ago. And one of them was, an ex-special ops guy. I was a Marine at the time, actually, a Marine reservist. And the other guy had been down to SEALs Buds training, right? And so I'm talking, these are some serious guys I'm with. And I was so excited to go bungee jumping. And when I got to the top and we were doing the countdown, which was 3, 2, 1, bungee and jump, there was no way I was going to do anything but jump. I was excited to jump. I couldn't wait to do it. I planned to do it even more than once. And yet, when I held on to those bars and swung out over and I was ready to let go, I was so shocked with the amount of fear as you look downward in kind of an unnatural way down 150 feet and make that jump. And it was really like a moment like that where I thought to myself, I am petrified as in the vulnerability I feel right now about to hit this send button.
Yeah.
And yet, there was never a moment where I wasn't going to hit it, but it was shocking.
And once you overcome it, once you do it, it's that momentum is set in action. And there's a powerful force, I believe, that goes into play. There's a powerful force that enters your psyche, right? You've done that, an achievement. You overcome it. That's where it all happens, in my opinion. That's the big mastery here. How exciting, man! I'm super excited to read the book. I've read the book summary. Can't wait for it to come out. When is it due out? You said sometime in May, June of 2020.
Yeah, it will definitely be done in May. We're just not sure the exact date because it will be in the hands of the Amazon publishing machine in about another week.
Wow, Amazon. I've had them in multiple conversations today alone, on all very different conversations. They're just, wow. Let's talk a little bit. Let's shift gears here real quick. We're in the middle of, I don't even know what week this is as far as the quarantine pandemic that we're in right now. I'm going to say it feels like week 4 or 5 of work from home, mandatory, retail closed. Starbucks, my office away from home is closed. And so as an organizational executive, as a leader and a consultant to these leaders, what do you think are going to be some of the bigger takeaways of this when we do go back? First of all, there's going to be a return to work, and what's that going to look like versus normal? And then what do you think ongoing are going to be some of the long-term changes to the enterprise as we know it?
Well, I think it's really one of the things that this whole event has driven home is the importance of leadership and is that community of effort. And people inherently felt leaders moving into this environment where suddenly they couldn't see their team every day. They weren't seeing their clients every day. You start to really grasp the need for frequent stakeholder engagement. And I think everyone's just sensitivity to the science of leadership, the focusing on my leadership really comes into perspective. And another thing I'll say is, in some ways, in this environment, the leading is easier. It will be actually, you asked, what will it be like when we go back to work? I think there will be a certain dip in everybody's performance and feelings around pulling things over the line. It was almost like a post-project depression, I used to always call it, where you've been in the crisis mode of pulling something over the line. Suddenly it happens. And afterwards, there's almost this big adrenaline dump. And when you're in the midst of it, like we are now, man, everybody is ready to step up. People understand that there's an importance and a purpose and a priority and things like that. And so they actually engage fairly readily. But I think what we're going to see is a bit of a dip in that energy as we do things like, return to the mechanics of our everyday life of getting ready for work, at a certain hour, jumping in a car, fighting through traffic, the things that we're actually benefiting by working from home. And all of us, I think, at least all the people that I've talked to, yourself included, have really reported the fact that, at first I wasn't sure how this was going to work for me. And now I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm super effective. I'm engaging. Everyone's really receptive. They're engaging really well, talking to a ton of people and really, nailing it. And I think that there's a lot of people experiencing that right now. And there might be a challenge for us coming back and returning to the way things were.
I don't disagree with that at all. I think that, like you alluded to, I believe, and I was the last to admit, I thought that working from home was going to be a big distraction for me in a lot of different ways. My work ethic, I thought, was defined by me leaving the house and being dressed for battle and being out there and doing what I do. But I've found that the work-life blend that I have is very, very conducive to working from home environment. And I've actually had a huge uptick in productivity. I've had more calls, more conversations, more meaningful dialogue. Video has been enabled, right? We've had it forever. We've had video for 4 or 5 years, I think, on everybody's clients, our meeting makers, if you will, our calendar invites all have a video element to it, but very few people ever used video until now. Now everybody, with the Zoom and Ring Central meetings and Teams and all of that are enabling video. I think we're having more and more conversations, more meaningful conversations, quicker that way than we have in a long time is one. But interesting when you say that there might be a dip when we go back. I have had a conversation last night when we had our OCTP virtual. We hosted the meeting. We had lots of topics of conversation go around the room about what's going to be like when you go back, or what's it like now working from a distributed workforce versus, like a remote worker environment, which everybody's in today. And it was a mixed bag of comments. There was a sales leader there. I would call him a sales leader. He's an organization leader, but his team is largely focused on client interaction. They're a capital leasing company, and he has 20 employees. And so he's concerned with metrics. He wants to know, he wants to see a reporting on email, voice time on the phone, Salesforce interaction. He wants to make sure his folks are working, right? When we brought that up, there was a team leader on the call for a big company here in Orange County who's in charge of the software development team. So he has a bunch of engineers that are development engineers, and he was adamantly opposed to any type of metrics around productivity. He was like, my guys would shudder at the thought of measurement of productivity by any, metrics around that. We develop, we create. Their output is going to be, their single and only source of measurement. And I was like, okay, that's, it's different for folks for different situations. But I'm a huge fan of Matt Mullenweg, who invented WordPress, billionaire and one of the new school folks. And he's all in on the distributed workforce model. As a matter of fact, says he's had dozens and dozens of employees that are critical to his organization that he's never interviewed live, never met them live before they got hired. They were met in the workflow that they would have every day as a distributed workforce, which is over a video call, through a Slack conversation, through get you involved in a mock project to see how you perform, that kind of thing. So it's a new world we're living in. I'm excited about it. I think that there's going to be some huge takeaways here.
Absolutely. And I think no matter what it unfolds as for us, and no matter what the emotional response is, one thing is for sure, it's going to be both a challenge and an opportunity for leaders to reestablish their communities of effort and really rethink how the work gets done. Whether that has anything to do with being remote or in person doesn't matter, but really thinking about how we do the work and how we connect that to our strategy and our purpose. Another thing that these kinds of crises put into perspective is what do we do that is valued most and most important and that must be continued. So I think you see a lot of organizations recognizing now what were the activities they were engaged in that just weren't adding value, but they were contributing to an overall complexity or a sense of distraction. And so there's something to be said for these kind of moments to really give you that clarity of purpose and focus in on what's important. What can we not drop the ball on? What do we have to deliver?
How can a leader develop, you call them communities of effort, but I'll use the word team for the moment. How can they develop a sense of community, right? A sense of team, remote, right? Or distributed? How do they do that? Do you have any tips or hacks for that?
Well, honestly, I think it's much the same as doing it in person, which is first, it's as I already said at the kind of the top of the cast here, it's all about structuring or designing the community. It's about operating or engaging it, and it's about perfecting it or improving it. So I think you got to take a swing at what is the scope of this community of effort. And for me, that stands for strategy, culture, objective, purpose, and ecosystem. And so when you're looking at a community of effort, you really need to say, where do we exist? What are the major stakeholder interactions that exist in this ecosystem? How do we contribute value to it, or what's our purpose? And then what are the appropriate kind of visionary long-term objectives as well as the mid and short-term ones? Make sure everybody understands those. I want to start talking about. Go ahead.
No. I want to touch base real quick. You talked about purpose, right? And you talked about purpose being different than the objective, right? And so, and I want to touch base on that. You're hitting on something that's important to me right now. So, can you describe a little bit about the differences there in your nomenclature?
Sure. Absolutely. So for me, if you start with the idea of your ecosystem, right? So that's a term that we're all used to hearing when we think about organizational or organisms in a system, right? What's their habitat? What are their key interactions? But it's just the same thing for businesses, right? What's our business ecosystem? What are our key stakeholders? And how do we interact with them? And then I look at purpose is when you take a look at those interactions and the value being delivered to the ecosystem, you start to then understand what is our purpose for being by looking at the top areas of value that you're adding in that ecosystem. Define your purpose for being. And that, to your point, is not the same thing as what you're trying to achieve.
Agreed.
And what goals and objectives might mark your pursuing, fulfilling that purpose.
So I find that to be
the same thing.
I find that to be true in my personal life, right? It starts with my purpose, but it didn't used to. It used to always be related to the goal at hand, right? Like I would set the goal, I want to achieve such and such, or I want to have such and such, or I want to be at such and such. And that was the goal, the objective, right? And without a purpose in that, I found myself often flailing and in misalignment, if you will, with what was how to get to that goal. And I often miss the goals. And I'll tell you, since I start with my purpose and then my goals in alignment with that purpose, things flow much more naturally in my life.
We're very much aligned there. I look at my own personal purpose in this whole endeavor that we're talking about is to inspire leaders to engage comprehensively and consistently in the act of leading. But my objective is to reach 1 million leaders in the next 3 years.
Wow.
Now I'm hoping
very specific
that I'm going to clobber that.
Yeah.
But that's my kind of humble objective that I'm going to hold myself to, is being able to measure and achieve that objective.
I love it. I love a guy who knows it and has it defined and has a plan. And your plan here includes this process that you've built, this framework and methodology in the form now of a book and a program to follow. And I'm looking forward to phase 2 here, Ed. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens once this book launches. I'm looking forward to getting the email marketing to come to your events and see you at keynotes.
Awesome.
And I can see the vision right now. I'm holding it for you, brother, and wishing you all the best here. What one nugget would you like to leave us with here on the podcast as we're ideally heading back to the work? I'm being optimistic. I'm hoping in the next week or two that we get the hall pass from the powers that be, that we can go mingle again in some different form. I don't think it's going to be the same form. I think social distancing will probably be a thing for some time. I think that masks will be a thing for some time. I'm talking to my clients right now about thermal imaging systems, which is a little Darwinian and all that kind of stuff, or Orwellian, I'm sorry, and those kind of things. So I think it's gonna be a bit different. But what would you one nugget you would give these leaders to be thinking about as we head back?
Make your leadership tangible by developing and deploying your standard operating procedures for structuring, operating, and perfecting your communities of effort. Do that, and you will lead a legacy.
Wow. You have your program ready to quote at any given moment. So you've definitely developed something that's repeatable in a process and a framework and a methodology. So excited to have you looking forward to your book. And thanks for the time here today, Ed.
Super appreciative. It's always great to be with you, and particularly great to have this opportunity to connect with your listeners. Thanks,
You
Mike.
got it. We'll leave show notes here with a website, with your website, leadershipsops.com. And again, Ed Tyson, thanks and good luck with the book.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, Mike here. Hope you liked this boardroom session. Please check back to our future sessions as we're recording a new one every month. If you want to reach out, look for me on LinkedIn or send me a note at mike@sidepath.com. That's Mike at sidepath.com.